There's always a choice on exams that I give. And I tell my students that when you're writing an exam, remember the following. 1, answer the question. You'd be surprised how often people don't answer the question. They have some things they'd like to talk about, so they talk about that. But think of the poor examiner. He or she thought so hard to try to make a nice question, and their feelings are hurt if you don't answer the question. It's not good to hurt the examiner's feelings. Okay, now the second thing is when you answer the question, know your stuff. You should be fully in charge of the material in lectures and reading. And then third, it's helpful if you think for yourself. If the exam is intelligently designed, you should have some opportunity to exercise your critical abilities. And fourth, it is immensely helpful if you can write coherent English. The all-time record was set by a guy who managed to write a 3-hour exam in which there was not a single grammatical English sentence. And when I pointed out that this was responsible in part for his low grade, he complained bitterly. He said he was a chemistry major and nobody had ever asked him to write a sentence before, and who the hell was I to ask him to write sentences? Well, anyhow, in my old-fashioned way, I appreciate English sentences. Paragraphs, I think, are too much to ask for, but sentences are much appreciated. And, of course, it's also nice if you can write legibly. I can't write legibly, so I'm the wrong guy to insist on that, but it does help the person reading the exam. Okay, any other bureaucratic-type questions? All right, yeah.
I have a bureaucratic comment. So the Monday sections will not be meeting this Monday.
Okay, Monday sections are not meeting this Monday. Fine. When is Labor Day, by the way? This business of starting before Labor Day, God invented Labor Day so we knew when to start school. But now it's just crazy to have do all this stuff before Labor Day. But Monday is not Labor Day? A week from Monday. So you're going to have 2 days off, it seems like, 2 Mondays. Well, that's all right. 3-day weekends. Okay. All right, so Monday sections are going to be deprived. All right. Okay, well, let's go to work then. Any more questions? Anything you guys want to announce? Are we all, everything's in order? All right, this is a course in the philosophy of language. And the central question of the course, to put it very crudely, is how exactly does language relate to reality? How are the different forms in which language relates to reality? Now, that question may seem different from the question, what is meaning? But I think in a way they're the same question because, of course, in some sense we want to say language relates to reality in virtue of meaning. So 2 ways to express the main subject matter of the course are what is meaning and how do words relate to reality. And I want you to be struck by the astounding character of the fact that we do this. I stand here and I have this hole in the bottom half of my face and I open it up and all this noise comes out. And in the linguistics textbooks in the old days, they used to show you diagrams of the tongue and the larynx and all that wet, slimy stuff in there. And I always felt that's not what I'm interested in. You know, that's just a kind of accident. I make these noises through my mouth. But the amazing thing is these noises have these remarkable properties. I say things that are true or false or boring or original or exciting or tiresome or tedious or irrelevant. How can noises have those properties? Also, people get excited about the noises you make through your mouth. For some reason, the university even pays me to make these noises. Not very much, but they do, not as much as they should, but they do pay us to make these noises through our mouth. So there must be something interesting about these noises. And how is that possible? What's going on? Now, in the 20th and 21st century, language has had a special role to play in philosophy. And many philosophers have thought that it was a defining role. I think that's maybe an exaggeration, but certainly your conception of language will have a powerful influence on your conception of philosophy. And I want to begin by describing certain linguistic distinctions, certain conceptions about language, which have had an influence on a corresponding conception of the nature of philosophy, the nature of the philosophical enterprise. Now, before I do that, let me say that there are two broad strands in the philosophy of language. There is one strand that takes mathematical logic to be the right model for understanding language. Ordinary language is a kind of practical device, but the bare bones structure, what counts, is given by the logical forms, and those are best explicated using the resources of modern logic. So there is a formal or mathematical or logical strand in the philosophy of mathematics, and there's also another strand which emphasizes the use of language in ordinary conversations and discussions and interchanges between speakers and hearers. So there's one branch of the philosophy of language that sees language as essentially a formal system or set of formal systems, much like mathematical systems, and another branch that emphasizes the social active character of language. I think the second branch is right, but there's a lot to be said for both, and I have to say that the most influential forms of the philosophy of language right now are the formalist or logical approach to problems in the philosophy of language. My situation in teaching the philosophy of language is a bit like my situation in teaching the philosophy of mind. I think the mainstream philosophy of mind is hopelessly mistaken and has been since Descartes. So I start off by attacking these guys, and then I tell you at the end what I think is the right way to do it. Here I'm going to reverse the order. I'm going to tell you at the beginning what I think is the right way to do the philosophy of language, and then I'm going to go through the history of this subject, essentially from Frege to the present. The philosophy of language was invented in the late 19th century by a German mathematician and logician and philosopher called Gottlob Frege, and in a sense we're all the heirs of Frege. And I think a lot of people would agree with me that after Kant, Frege is the most important German philosopher. He revolutionized, at least three subjects: logic, the foundations of mathematics, and philosophy of language. In any case, the subject was invented by Frege, and it has followed. We've been discussing problems that we've inherited from Frege right down to the present time. But as I said, there are these two strands, and the strand that is dominant uses the resources that Frege invented, particularly modern mathematical logic. There's a distinction, though, between the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, as far as I'm concerned, because it seems to me that the mainstream philosophy of mind, which inherits Descartes' categories. You're supposed to have a choice. You can be either a dualist or a materialist, and I think that's a hopeless conception of the subject. But there, I think the mistakes are fairly easy to point out. I mean, everything from dualism to the computational theory of the mind to functionalism and behaviorism, I can point those out fairly easily. But in the philosophy of language, it's pretty tough stuff. And the guys who do it are pretty smart, and you can't just, it's not a simple argument. So I'm going to give you what I think is the right way to do it before I try to tell you what I think is wrong with the way that it's standardly done in the philosophical literature. Okay, so that's placing the issues in some historical context, but now let's go through some linguistic distinctions. There is a traditional distinction. It goes back a long time, but this jargon comes from Kant, whereby we make a distinction between synthetic statements and analytic statements. And a synthetic statement is one which is true or false in virtue of some facts in the world. An analytic statement is one which is true or false in virtue of the meanings of the words themselves. So the famous examples of analytic statements are all bachelors are unmarried, 2 + 2 = 4, all women are female, where the truth is supposed to follow from the definition. But synthetic statements, if they're true or false, it's not just a matter of definition. You've got to know something about how the world is. So if I say, most bachelors in Berkeley own at least one pair of blue jeans, well, that's a synthetic statement, and you can't figure out that truth just by looking at the meanings of the words. You'd have to go do an investigation. This is a semantic distinction, has to do with meaning. Analytic statements are true or false in virtue of meaning. Synthetic statements in virtue of something beyond meaning, some facts in the world. Now that's supposed to be related to another famous distinction between propositions which have to be known after investigation, after an investigation using experiences, and those which can be known prior to any such investigation. And these classical languages are frequently invoked here. The ones that are known prior to investigation, like all bachelors are unmarried or 2 + 2 = 4, are said to be a priori. They are known prior to experience, whereas things like bachelors wear blue jeans or the incidence of alcoholism among Berkeley bachelors has increased, those are a posteriori. And this is an epistemic distinction. This is a distinction in how these propositions are known. And the idea that people had is that analytic propositions can be known a priori, but synthetic propositions have to be known a posteriori. And Kant, for those of you who've ever studied any Kant, made a big deal out of trying to find propositions that were both synthetic and could be known a priori. He thought he had a bunch, and then he tried to figure out how they were possible. Okay, now these two are related to another crucial distinction between propositions that are said to be contingent as opposed that are said to be necessary. And this is a logical, or some people even would say a metaphysical distinction. It's a contingent fact that bachelors in Berkeley wear blue jeans, but it is not a contingent fact that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a necessary truth. It's a necessary fact. It has to be the case that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, in the heyday of analytic philosophy, the kind of philosophy invented by Gottlob Frege and the kind that's dominant throughout the English-speaking world now, in the heyday, these were supposed to be 3 different ways of marking the same distinction. All analytic propositions can be known to be true a priori, and all analytic propositions are necessary because their necessity derives from the meanings of the words used to express the proposition. Meaning guarantees truth. Synthetic propositions have to be known a posteriori, and they don't state necessary truths, they state contingent truths. So if you're looking at academic subjects, the sciences are over here on this side, and logic and mathematics is over here on this side. Logic and mathematics state propositions which are necessary a priori and analytic, whereas the natural sciences, including the social sciences, state propositions that are contingent a posteriori and synthetic. Okay, now everybody's got that, I hope. I'll take questions in a minute, but I want to introduce another distinction which was crucial for the conception that people had of philosophy, and that's a distinction between propositions which state matters of fact, which are said to be factual or sometimes descriptive, and that includes all that stuff up there, all of the synthetic, analytic, and so on. But there are lots of other utterances that, according to this conception, aren't really true or false because they are evaluative or emotive. So if you say things like, there are lots of grandmothers, emotive, there are lots of grandmothers who ride buses in Berkeley, that is a factual statement. You could find out bus ridership. But if you made a moral statement, you shouldn't push grandma off the bus, or you ought not to, or it's immoral to push grandma off the bus, that's not a factual statement. That's an evaluation. That tells you what's good or bad, but it's not, according to these guys, literally true or false. Now, incidentally, I'm trying to make this sound plausible to you, all this, okay, but I don't believe any of what I've told you so far, okay? I'm just telling you what the subject, history of the subject is, and I want you to have a feel for it, because it's not unintelligent. Okay, so there's a distinction between the factual and the descriptive, and that includes all that, and the evaluative and the emotive. Now, over here is all of ethics and aesthetics. Okay, now then the question is, where does philosophy fit in? Well, philosophy has to tell you the truth. Philosophers are telling you truth, so they can't tell you anything evaluative or emotive. They can't tell you that Beethoven is a better composer than the latest. I don't even know the names. I don't know the famous composers in rap music. Perhaps there are none. But okay, let's say Beethoven is a better composer than the average rap musician. They would say that's evaluative. You can't know that that's true or false. That just expresses your attitudes or your emotions or your evaluations. Okay, now so the story goes, if philosophy is to tell you the truth, it can't be giving you any evaluations. It can't tell you anything in ethics or aesthetics, because those can't be true or false. So what the philosopher does is tell you something that's true, but what kind of truth is it? Well, the philosopher's not a scientist. He doesn't go in the lab and do a whole lot of experiments, but he states analytic truths. So his activity is like that of the logician and the mathematician. So when Hume says causes have to come before or simultaneous with their effects, they can't come after the effects, the idea is that is supposed to be an analytic truth. It's a necessary truth about causation, but it's arrived at by the analysis of meanings. So if you accept these linguistic distinctions, and a lot of people did, and many people still do, you get a certain very precise and elegant, though rather limited, conception of philosophy. The philosopher doesn't tell you how to live, because there's no true propositions that you can make about that. All you can do is express your feelings and attitudes, and the philosopher is no better than anybody else to have feelings and attitudes. So, but if the philosopher is going to tell you the truth, he has to tell you a priori analytic truths, and those will be truths that articulate the structure of our concepts. So the philosopher will tell you that the analysis of cause requires that causes have to come prior to the effects. They can't come after the effects. The philosopher will give you an analysis of these concepts, including the analysis of ethical and aesthetic concepts, but the philosopher doesn't try to tell you any substantive, synthetic, factual, or descriptive statements about the contingent real world. He gives you factual, descriptive statements about the structure of concepts. Now, this was an elegant conception of philosophy, where we're to think of philosophy as coming. If you think of language as hovering over the world and describing it, and language as part of people's engaging in activity, then the philosopher comes in from the side and describes these relations between language and reality. It's an elegant conception, and it was very influential for a long time. Now, lately, it has come under a prodigious number of attacks. I have myself attacked this distinction between evaluative and descriptive in some of its versions. There have been a number of attacks on the analytic-synthetic distinction, and nowadays I think an awful lot of people think that you don't get this correspondence between propositions that are necessary and propositions that are analytic and a priori. So, for example, a lot of philosophers nowadays think that there are propositions that are a posteriori, you only can find out by investigation, but what you find out is a necessary truth. So there are necessary a posteriori propositions. The favorite example is always water is H2O. You have to do an investigation to find out that water is H2O. You can't just look at the meanings of the words, but when you find it out, what you've discovered is a necessary truth. So I want you to see that there are these distinctions, and they're going to be important in what we do. But we're going to, between now and the end of the semester, we're going to get to the bottom of how it actually works. Okay, now there's some other notions that I want you to have in your repertoire. So far, I've tried to tell you that there are these families of notions about the nature of language that determine the nature of philosophy. And for a long time, they were accepted that philosophy was essentially an activity of conceptual analysis, whereby the philosopher investigates the use of language and comes up with a set of analytic truths that articulate the relationships between the philosophically puzzling notions, including notions in ethics and aesthetics. But there the philosopher makes no substantive claims about how you ought to live or what you ought to appreciate, but just what it means to make claims about how you ought to live or what you ought to appreciate. Okay, that is by way of setting the background for much of the debates that we're going to be considering. Now I got to give you some more tools so you will understand the issues that I will be raising and that will come up in the literature. Now the way I like to lecture is I talk for a while and then stop for questions. And so if you have questions, you save them, because every few minutes I'm going to shut up and take questions. So this is a good time. Any questions so far? I've actually said an awful lot of very substantive material, and if you didn't understand it yet, don't worry too much, because we're going to go over it more slowly and go into more detail about the various finer points. Any questions so far? Okay, well, I think what I'll do now is introduce a bunch of distinctions that are essential in the study of language, just so you won't be intimidated by the jargon. It's awfully easy to get scared by the jargon, and people always try to do that. I mean, one of the things that's fun about taking an advanced course in anything is that you learn a lot of big words. And then you can use them to snow the amateurs. But I've discovered this when people in artificial intelligence were making a whole lot of idiotic claims about how if you got the right computer program, you'd be creating a mind in the same sense that you and I have a mind. And I pointed out that was obviously false. And they immediately hit me with a whole lot of fancy technical words that I can't even remember them now. I'm a bit jet lagged. I got in late last night from Europe, so the system's only working on a few cylinders. But in any case, it's easy to learn the words, and I'm going to teach you the meanings of some of the crucial words now. Okay, an important distinction in the study of language is the distinction between syntax and semantics. And syntax has to do with the formal structure of the sentence. Is it a subject-predicate sentence? Is it a relational sentence? And what are the elements of the sentence? The notion of a word or a morpheme is a syntactical notion. So syntax is a matter of form. What are the words and sentences? Those are syntactical notions. But of course, the whole idea of having words and sentences is to talk with. And when you talk with them, you're supposed to say something meaningful. And that is where semantics comes in. So syntax is formal structure, semantics is meaning. We will be studying a lot of semantics, and the job of the syntax is to carry the semantics. The minimal complete unit is the entire sentence, and that's a syntactical notion. But what the hell is a sentence, and why should it be the minimal meaningful unit? Now, there's another notion that some authors bring in, and that's the notion of pragmatics. So they say, in addition to the form and the meaning, there is the use, and people can put the same meanings, meanings expressed in the same form, there's the same semantics and syntax, they can put it to different uses. Well, how so? Well, that introduces another distinction, and that's the distinction between the meaning of the sentence meaning versus what speakers mean when they utter the sentence. So there's a sentence meaning as distinct from speaker meaning. And there are lots of famous examples of the distinction. And in fact, if you listen carefully to yourself and your friends, you'll find that all day long you are saying more than what the sentences that you utter mean. That is, you will have a speaker meaning that goes beyond sentence meaning. You're sitting at the table at lunch and you say, "Can you pass the salt?" And the guy who hears that doesn't think for a while and say, "Yeah, I can." No, he actually, if he's fully socialized, he will pass you the salt. I mean, and there are a lot of comic routines done on this, where the person takes the utterance completely literally. The guy is stopped on the streets of Paris and asked, "Do you know where the Palace Hotel?" And he thinks around and says, "Yes," and then walks on. Well, of course, that's missing the point. Here, the point of the particular semantics was to convey a speaker meaning, and the speaker meaning of "can you pass the salt" goes beyond the semantic meaning. It contains also "pass the salt," or even "please pass the salt," and that involves something that I call an Indirect Speech Act, where when you ask the guy, "Can you pass the salt?" You're asking a question about his abilities, but you are doing more than that. That's what you directly asked, but what you did indirectly was convey a request. You made an indirect request, and I call those Indirect Speech Acts. Okay, so we have the distinction between syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and that's going to be important to us because there's going to be a distinction we need to make between what is actually said in an utterance, what is the actual literal meaning of the sentences uttered, and what the speaker says in the larger pragmatic sense of what the speaker means as part of his speaker meaning, not as part of his sentence meaning. And if you listen closely, you'll find an awful lot of what people say contains meanings that go beyond the semantic meaning of the sentence. The speaker meaning exceeds the semantic meaning of the syntactical forms that are uttered. Now, one of the main topics of this course, in the second part, will be how many ways are there that the sentence meaning and the speaker meaning can come apart. There's obviously indirect speech acts, but a famous case is metaphor. In the case of metaphors, you utter something that has a strict sentence meaning, but you seem to be conveying something more than, or something quite different from, the semantic meaning of the sentence. Other cases are irony and sarcasm. You say, "Oh, he's very intelligent," or you mean he's a total idiot, or something to that effect. You have something where you say one thing but mean the opposite of what you say. And there are a whole lot of traditional rhetorical devices, understatement and hyperbole, as well as all these more fancy versions like metaphor and metonymy and anakaluthon and all the rest of it. And we'll get to those when we discuss the relationships between sentence meaning and speaker meaning. And then we're going to have the question, well, which is prior? Which is the one that matters most? Which is the basic one? And I'm going to argue later on, this is the one that does the work, speaker meaning. The purpose of the sentence is to enable speakers to talk with it. However, that's not to say that sentences are not crucial. They're absolutely fundamental. And the remarkable thing about human communication systems as opposed to animal communication systems is that we can do things with sentences that go far beyond what any animal known to me can do. And that's because our sentences have some other features. I'm not going to tell you all of them just yet, but I want to mention two of them. They have compositionality and generativity. Compositionality is just a fancy way of saying that you can tell the meaning of the sentence from the meaning of the parts and the way they are composed, the way the sentence is composed. The meaning of the sentence is a compositional function. It's determined in a compositional way by the elements of the sentence and how they are arranged. So you all hear the difference between John loves Mary and Mary loves John. You hear that difference, even though the sentence contains exactly the same elements. It contains them in a different order. The syntactical order of the sentence is different, and that order determines a different meaning. Furthermore, that you hear the sentence, John loves Mary and Mary is loved by John, even though those sentences are different, they mean the same. The transformation to the active, to the passive, doesn't alter the meaning. And this is a remarkable feature of language, that you can understand new sentences. See, my dog Gilbert is pretty smart, and he understands a lot of stuff, but he cannot use sentences in a compositional fashion. He can think there's somebody at the door. There's no question he thinks that, because I can fool him by doing this. I knock and I say, "Hi!" And then Gilbert will come out of his bedroom barking like crazy, and who is this guy? And there's nobody there, and he looks surprised, and I feel sometimes bashful that I played a trick on him. But in any case, he can think there's somebody at the door, but he can't think, I wish there were 1,000 people at the door. And he can't make the difference between someone is approaching the door and the door is being approached by someone. He can't get the distinction between the active and the passive, because however he thinks he has not got compositional principles that enable him to shuffle meaningful elements at will. Now that is a stunning human achievement. It's in dispute how much other animals have it. I don't deny that they have it to some extent, but I don't know of any animal that has it in the way that human beings have it. That is, where you can shuffle, using your own free will, you can shuffle the syntactical elements of the sentence to make completely new and unheard of sentences. And if you think about compositionality seriously, it is quite stunning. I can now, without any rehearsal, produce sentences you've never heard before and will never hear again, I hope. And yet, in some sense, you understand what I mean. I might say, there were 10,000 freshmen standing on the top of Mount Everest eating McDonald's hamburgers covered with ketchup and limeade. All of the time they were standing on their head and eating with their elbows. Okay, I never heard that sentence before, right? And that's one sentence. There were some commas in it, but it was one sentence. And you've never heard it before. I hope you'll never hear it again. It's not all that good a sentence, but the remarkable thing about human language, and this is a stunning fact, is that you can produce meaningful elements, meaningful units, meaningful sentences that you've never heard before, and you understand them. It's no big deal to understand these sentences. Okay, now compositionality is related to, but not the same as, generativity. Generativity is another remarkable fact about human languages. And again, Frege was the guy who put his finger on all of this stuff. This is what I'm telling you now is straight Frege. And that is that you can generate not just new sentences. Strictly speaking, you can generate an infinite number of new sentences. And you can do that because you have rules that apply over and over, so-called recursive rules, where the rule will apply to its own output. The favorite of pompous English speakers is the relative clause. So you can say, I met the man who lives in Sacramento where my aunt worked when she left Santa Barbara, which is where my uncle still lives while he is still employed by the utility company, which is slowly going broke, and you go on and on. Now again, I just made all that crap up on the spot, and if I were more awake, I could probably give you a better example. But the marvelous thing about that fact, about this capacity, is you can generate an indefinite number of new sentences. It isn't just that you can produce some new sentences. If you had a language that allowed you to say John loves Mary and Mary loves John, you'd have compositionality, but not much you can do with it. You've got to have rules that apply over and over, like the rules for forming conjunctions or relative clauses, or rules that involve words like because, and those are cases where you get generativity. You're able to generate new sentences without limit. There's no upper limit. Now, you have to be careful. When I say there are an infinite number of sentences in English or any other natural languages, I'm not saying there are sentences that have infinite length. That's a different point. This is the point that for any sentence you give me, I can always make a longer sentence. Just as for any number you give me, I can always produce a successor of that number. So there is no upper limit to the number of sentences that can be produced. Okay, so in an account of language, we've got to account for compositionality and generativity, and the way those are done in languages like English is through manipulations of the syntax. It's a syntactical rule that enables you to take a sentence, take another sentence, and use the second sentence as a relative clause on the first sentence. So I went to see my grandmother. My grandmother lives in Sacramento. From those two you get, I went to see my grandmother who lives in Sacramento. Now, do all languages have this kind of stuff? Pretty much. Now, there is a debate going on right now because a guy named Dan Everett went to live with some people in the Amazon basin, and they're called a Pitaha. It's spelled Piraha, but it's pronounced Pitaha, a tribe in the Amazon basin. And Dan says, and he's the most honest guy I know, he says they have no relative clauses. They have no recursive rules at all. They can't say, I went to see my grandmother who lives down the river. They have to say, I went to see my grandmother lives down the river. They cannot make relative clauses. Now, this is a big deal, this issue, because there's another guy, Noam Chomsky, who's argued that all languages have a common underlying syntactical structure called universal grammar. He modified that a bit, but that's the basic idea. And he even says that the essence of human language is recursion, is having these recursive rules. Well, Dan claims to have a language in the Amazon basin for which there are no recursive rules, and this is a debate that's going on. I won't attempt to resolve the debate right now, but I want to call your attention to the fact that there's a debate between Dan on the one hand and Chomsky and his colleagues, there are a lot of them, on the other, about whether or not the Pitaha actually form a counterexample to Chomsky's conception of universal grammar. That's a big issue, and I'll come back to that when we talk about how the stuff that we're talking about in the course relates to the science of linguistics, how it relates to the study of actual human languages. Okay, let's stop for questions. Again, I said an awful lot. Yeah?
Professor Searle, you said that under the auspices of generativity, that's where the recursive rules are?
Yes. That recursive rules generate an indefinitely large number of new sentences, because the recursive rule is a rule that applies over and over and applies to its own output. So the recursive rule that says you can always add a relative clause can then be applied to the very relative clause that you added. So I went to see the man who lives down the street where we used to live when we lived on Yosemite Road. I mean, you can keep going with these. Once you get once the recursive rule squirts out a new clause, you can apply it again to the clause that just got squirted out. I'm sorry for this unfortunate metaphor, but anyhow. Part of my brain is still over the Atlantic. I thought, well, what the hell? I'll sleep on the plane. Not a good idea. But anyhow. Okay, other questions? That's a good question. Yeah.
The idea of being able to create infinite amount of sentences.
You're going to have to talk louder for me.
Like the idea of being able to create like an infinite amount of sentences, it sounds a lot like what Chomsky proposes.
Well, there are, you can easily invent a machine that will produce an infinite number of new sentences. It's not that's a rather simple rule. And indeed, elementary arithmetic has a recursive device which enables you to generate an infinitely long, an infinite number of numerals. And it does it simply by adding 1. You take any number you've got and add 1, and that gives you a new number. But I may not be understanding the question.
Well, is that part of Chomsky?
Now, I'm not going to give you a real lecture on Chomsky's linguistics today. I mean, the worst thing I can do is give you the impression that you understand something that I haven't yet explained to you. So let me say this much. Here is the remarkable fact about human beings, and it is a stunning fact. The child acquires a remarkably complex structure, the structure of English or French or Chinese or Swahili, at a very early age, at the age of 2 years or even less, and acquires this without any training. The kid just picks it up. Middle-class parents have the illusion that they teach the children the language, and to this day I'm convinced that I taught my little brother how to speak English, that Billy Boy learned it from me, but I have to admit that the evidence for that is slim, that in fact the child just picks it up. The child picks up a remarkably complex formal structure. It's much more complicated than axiomatic set theory. But try teaching axiomatic set theory to a 2-year-old. You're just not going to get anywhere. Whereas the kid will pick up English, which is much more complicated, much more difficult, and he just does it more or less automatically. It just seems to come. And furthermore, they do it without formal training, and the exposure they get is imperfect because the sentences that they hear are typically ungrammatical. It contains all kinds of breaks and pauses and starts and stops. So the kid acquires this incredible formal structure. How is it possible? Well, Chomsky postulated that it's only possible because, in a sense, the kid knows it already. It's already programmed into his brain. In the child's brain at birth is programmed a universal grammar. And the universal grammar gives the child a language acquisition device because it's got this universal grammar which enables it to process incoming stimuli in such a way as to produce sentences as output. And there are a whole lot of other arguments for this. I won't go through them all this morning, but acquiring a language doesn't seem to be a function of intelligence. Smart kids and dumb kids learn the same language. Smart kids tend to have bigger vocabularies, but basically it's the same syntax, the same language. It's done without training, and here's another remarkable fact. It has to be done at a certain, rather precise period in the child's development. If the child gets to adolescence without having been exposed to a language, it's very hard to teach them language after that. There are some horrible cases, and I'm too upset already to tell you about them now, but I'll tell you about them later in the course. When children didn't have a chance to be exposed to language, and it was only when they were adolescents. And then it's clear that the mechanisms by which they're trying to acquire the language aren't the same. They're not using the same apparatus that the infant uses when the kid just picks it up. When the kid picks it up by in a sense, generating the language. And one good evidence for that is the mistakes that children make. The children will produce words that the kid has never heard before, and yet they make perfectly good sense. I'll give you an example. When my oldest son was very young, he used the word emment as I am a good boy, emment I. Now, that's not something he ever heard anybody say. There's a sense in which he invented it, but it's not an arbitrary invention. It makes perfectly good sense. There ought to be such a word in English, along with isn't, wasn't, aren't, etc. Why not emment? Well, I looked it up, and there was such a word. It is the original of the word ain't, which we are now assured ain't in the dictionary. It's very hard for English speakers to do the sequence of consonants, so they shorten it. It comes out as ain't, and it is the original for ain't. Okay, now what's interesting about that is here is the child acquiring a language and producing words that he's never heard. And the way that he does that is by overgeneralizing from words that he has heard. Again, the past tense is a good case of this because the children will regularize, so they'll say, I walked and I runned. And that makes perfectly good sense. It's just not good English. They have to learn the exceptions. They have to learn the exceptional cases on an ad hoc basis, one at a time. All right. So here are cases where it isn't so much a child learning a language in the sense of memorizing a set of words and sentences, but the child acquiring exposure to a language where the child's innate mechanism then enables it to produce sentences of the language. Now, in the early days of MIT linguistics, this was the prevailing view, is that we all had in our heads at birth a universal grammar, and the universal grammar was common to all human languages. The objection to that was always, well, languages are so different. Chinese is really different from English. And the MIT answer to that was, no, they're not so different. They look different on the surface, but in fact, underneath, in the deep structure, all human languages are pretty much the same. They all have sentences. The sentences have noun phrases and verb phrases. The noun always dominates the adjectives and the verbs in the rules for constructing the sentences. And when I worked at MIT, the standard joke was that all languages are really Latin. All languages are really Latin, except Latin, which is really English. And that's because most of the people in Building 20 could only speak English, and usually a rather unattractive dialect of Brooklyn English. But in any case, the idea was that the differences among languages were really superficial, that at bottom, all human languages were pretty much the same. Now, that pretty picture was destroyed by a guy named Ken Hale. And Hale was one of these guys who could go anywhere and pick up the language in a couple of weeks. I mean, he was phenomenal. And he went to Australia. He went to the Australian outback and learned some Australian languages that just didn't fit the Chomsky model. Well, now, what do you do when your theory is refuted? Well, an ingenious person absorbs the refutation as part of the theory. And what they said at this point was, well, in fact, it isn't that there's a list of the rules of universal grammar, but rather there's this big machine in your head that has all these principles, and when you're exposed to particular languages, the language will set the parameters of those particular principles. So the universal grammar model was replaced by principles and parameters. What we have is not a fixed list of rules, but a set of principles for forming rules, and those rules are those principles can then be fixed. It's like a big machine with a lot of switches, and when the child hears French, she will set the switches for French And when she hears English, she'll set the switches for English. But the switches are there, and the principles on which the switches operate are there at birth. It's just that the parameters are not yet fixed. Okay, I'm not going to resolve this morning. I just want you to see that the issues we're going to be talking about in the philosophy of language extend beyond philosophical questions to cover questions about the nature of human languages and the actual structure of human languages. Now, most logicians don't give a damn about this because in formal logical languages like the predicate calculus, you don't have to worry about relative clauses. You lay it all out as a series of sentences and iterated forms of quantifiers and modal operators. We'll get to that later on. Okay, so let's think how much we've covered this morning. I've said that there's a traditional way of making distinctions between synthetic, a posteriori contingent propositions on the one hand, and analytic a priori necessary propositions on the other. And that in its simplest form, that gives you a very elegant conception of philosophy. Philosophy consists of stating analytic truths about concepts. It's essentially a conceptual inquiry. For a number of reasons, that picture has come under attack. I haven't told you the most powerful forms of the attack, but there are a number of reasons that it has come under attack. Now, in addition to that, though, we also need the distinction between syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and that acquires some of its interest because we need a distinction between sentence meaning and speaker meaning. We need to get the idea that when people actually communicate with each other, they use sentences, but the meaning of what they say typically differs from the meaning of the sentence they uttered. They may mean more, they may mean less, they may mean something different, as in the case of metaphor. They may mean the opposite, as in the case of sarcasm and irony. But there's a systematic set of relations between the sentence meaning and the speaker meaning. You can't say anything and mean anything, but you can do an awful lot in speaking by uttering sentences that don't express exactly the message that you're trying to communicate. Okay, now that relates to two other principles that we're going to need, and those are the principles of compositionality, that the sentence is a composition, the meaning of the sentence is a compositional function of the meanings of the parts and their arrangement in the sentence. And then you need also the notion of generativity, that in actual human languages we have the capacity to generate an indefinite number of new sentences. Okay. Now, there are a couple of things, I mean, we're getting a sort of manageable picture, but there are a couple of things that upset the traditional order, the traditional elegance of the picture. And one I want to call your attention to now because we're going to be spending some time on it. And that is, Austin noticed, that's J.L. Austin, an Oxford philosopher. Austin noticed that there are lots of utterances that are perfectly legitimate utterances, but don't seem to aim at stating something true or false. If I say, I promise to come and see you, I'm making a promise. If I say, I order you to leave the room, I'm issuing an order. And I pick one of Austin's example, in a wedding ceremony, when the preacher says to the man, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? And he says to the woman, do you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband? When he says that, and they answer, yes, I do, as Austin says, they're not describing a marriage. It isn't that they're giving a description. They are getting married. They're indulging in a marriage. It's what's happening. And Austin noticed that all of these cases have these remarkable verbs. You can adjourn the meeting, if you're the right authority, simply by saying, I adjourn the meeting, or the meeting is adjourned. You can even declare war by saying, war is declared, or we hereby declare war. And Austin introduced the notion of a performative. And he said that if we're looking at language, it isn't just we have to look at propositions which are analytic and synthetic or evaluative and descriptive, that those categories weren't rich enough to capture the idea of there being utterances, the making of which is the performance of an action. You're doing the action, and you're doing the action named by the verb. So you can order somebody to leave the room by saying, I order you to leave the room. Now you can also do it without a performative verb by using the imperative mood, by saying leave the room, or even leave the room, and that's an order. So he identified what he thought were a class of performative utterances, and he contrasted those with the philosopher's favorites, which were constative utterances, which were cases where you had an utterance which set out to be true or false. So a constative utterance would be, it's raining, and a performative utterance would be, I ask you to close the windows. On the performative, you perform the act named by the verb. What's the difference then between the performative utterance and the constative utterance? Well, the constative utterance can be true or false, and the performative utterance cannot be true or false. At least it doesn't seem it can, but it's more like it's okay or not okay. It's felicitous or infelicitous, he says. It can be appropriate or not appropriate. If I stand up in the middle of an academic senate meeting and say, the meeting is adjourned, well, that's infelicitous. I'm not the authority. I can't get away with that. If I go in front of the Congress and say, war is declared, it doesn't work. It's infelicitous. Okay, so constatives are true or false. Performatives are infelicitous. Furthermore, it seems that there are special verbs for these performative utterances, special performative verbs, and they have this peculiar syntactical property that they take certain modifiers. The favorite modifiers of performative verbs are hereby. I hereby order you to leave the room. The meeting is hereby adjourned. Whereas with constatives, you just have ordinary indicative sentences, like it's raining, or 2 + 2 = 4. And then the big difference that seems to underlie these is that the performatives are all cases of actions. They're cases of doings and not just cases of saying. When you make a performative utterance, war is declared, you're married, I bet you $5 the Giants will have another bad season. All of those are cases where you're doing something and not just describing, not just saying something. Okay, now that looked pretty good. You've got a distinction between the philosopher's favorites, the constatives over here that can be true or false. They come in regular, what in America we call declarative sentences, but in England they just say indicative sentences. And they're sayings, they're utterings, as opposed to the performatives, which are not true or false, but felicitous or infelicitous. They have special verbs, and they're actions. They're all cases of action. Now, what happens often is what looks like a new kind of case, the performative case, may have features that swallow the general case. And that is, if you look closely over here, you'll find that you can't make the distinction in this way. Lots of performatives can be true or false. I warn you that it's going to rain today. Well, that's likely to be a false warning, because it's whatever else is going to happen in Berkeley today, it's not going to rain, or so I don't promise you, but that would be my statement. Okay, and furthermore, there can be felicitous and infelicitous constatives. If I now say, there are exactly 37 people in the next room, and you say, well, how do you know? Well, I just said it. I mean, it's a free country. Well, there's something wrong with that. If I make a firm claim, I am required by the rationality of the language, by the structure of the Speech Act, to being able to answer such question as, how do you know? Furthermore, there are verbs that you can use for constatives, such as state. I hereby state that it's raining is as much a use of a Speech Act verb as I hereby promise to come and see you next Wednesday. But then if that's right, then it looks like all of these cases over here are also doings, saying and doing don't mark exclusive categories. All sayings are kinds of doings. And that led Austin to suggest, well, maybe we ought to think of all utterances as speech acts. Maybe the basic unit of analysis is not the sentence, but rather, because the sentence is used to talk with, what we're interested are the speech acts that people perform when they talk. And they make statements, give descriptions, make questions, give answers to questions, make orders, requests, promises, vows, threats, pledges, apologies, thanks, and congratulations, just to think of a few that I can think of at this time of the morning. So you get a very large number of different kinds of speech acts, and maybe that is the right unit to approach in analyzing language. Think of the sentence as, above all, a device to talk with. And what is talking? Talking is performing a certain kind of action. Okay, well, I covered too much material in this lecture, and I'm going to bring it to a close shortly. But what I want you to see is there are a number of crucial distinctions that have been important historically, and which we're going to have to take seriously in the analysis, even if to some extent we challenge them or reject them. There are a series of principles that I want you to have in the back of your mind. I want you to see the distinction between syntax and semantics and pragmatics, and I want you to see, above all, perhaps, the distinction between what the sentence means as an element in the language and what the speaker means when he or she utters the sentence, between speaker meaning and sentence meaning. And then I want you to understand that the resources of the language have to give you compositionality and generativity. Okay, any questions before we break up for this morning? Yes?
Are indirect speech acts the same as the speaker meaning?
Speaker meaning and sentence meaning can coincide. And if you say to me, how much is 2 plus 2? And I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, the speaker meaning and the sentence meaning can coincide. But there are lots of cases where this, don't snap your notebooks just yet, I'm still talking. There are lots of cases where the speaker meaning and the sentence meaning come apart. You say to me, how did Sally behave at the party? And I say 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, then I kind of leave it open. What the hell is he driving at, you see? And then your imagination has to go. So that's a case where we would assume speaker meaning and sentence meaning are coming apart. What did he mean by that would be the question we would want to ask. So in the ideal case, speaker meaning and sentence meaning can coincide. But I think in ordinary conversation, it doesn't coincide much, because we always have much more in mind than is actually expressed in the sentence. Now, there's another principle that I'm going to tell you about next Tuesday, and that is all sentences are understood against a background of presuppositions, ways of behaving, how the world works, which are not part of the meaning of the sentence. So if you read, they went to a restaurant and she ate halibut and he ate a steak, well, there's just an enormous amount of information that you will bring to bear that enables you to understand those sentences, which is not contained in the meaning of the sentence. I mean, for example, you know that they ate the fish and the steak by putting it in their mouths and chewing on it. They didn't stuff it in their ear or absorb it through the skin by some metamorphosis. There are ways in which people eat things, and you take that for granted. Doesn't have to be included in the meaning of the sentence. You bring that to bear when you understand the sentence, and I want to say you bring that to bear when you understand any sentence. Any sentence requires, and I'm going to introduce 2 technical terms. It requires a network of other information about what's happening. And in addition to the network, it requires a background of skills and abilities and dispositions. You have to understand a society if I say they jumped in the car and drove to Sacramento, you immediately take an enormous amount for granted. You know, they first didn't eat the car, and then I run with the car inside their stomachs to Sacramento, and they didn't dig a tunnel between here and Sacramento in order to get there. You immediately get a picture of how the world works, and that's the application of the network in the background. And I'm going to make a strong claim. All understanding goes on within a network of other meanings and other mental states, and against a background of capacities. And think of any sentence. Sally enrolled in Berkeley because she wanted eventually to go to law school, and she thought a Berkeley degree would help her get into a good law school. In order to understand that sentence, you would have to have a prodigious intellectual resources. As I said, Gilbert is a very intelligent dog, but I would never try to explain to him what's in that sentence. You know, I show him Sally, and I show him Berkeley, and I show him the law school, and here, Gilbert, have a look. It's not going to work, you see. He does not have the network and the background. I'm sorry to make rude remarks about Gilbert. I'll bring him to class someday, and you'll see what an intelligent dog he is, though, alas, he can't talk. He'd like to talk, but he can't talk. Now, Frege, I've had 4 dogs, Frege, Russell, Ludwig, and Gilbert is named after Gilbert Ryle. Frege was the most intelligent dog I've ever met, and Frege simply seemed to understand English. You know, I'd tell him, Frege, go stand over there, and he'd just go. I didn't have to train him. And once we used to go to restaurants on Telegraph and just leave him outside the restaurant. Once we came out of a restaurant at lunchtime, Frege was gone. No Frege. Well, I didn't know what to do. Call a dog pound. I rushed back to the office, and there was Frege waiting outside the office door. He got sick of waiting around with all those deadbeats on Telegraph. He went back to Moses Hall and parked himself outside the door. Anyway, I never trust dog owners because they always anthropomorphize their dogs. Okay, we're going to go on with this on Tuesday, and between now and Tuesday, I want you to read the article by Austin called Performative Utterances. I'll see you on Tuesday.